In this podcast episode, host Stephen engages with Professor Robert Pape, a renowned expert on military strategy and air campaigns, to analyze the unfolding conflict involving Iran, the United States, and regional actors. The conversation touches on the limits of military force against Iran, the implications of drone and missile warfare, the role of Israel in the conflict, the fragmentation of U.S. alliances, and the broader geopolitical shifts with Eurasian powers. They also delve into the human cost of war for ordinary Iranians, the potential paths forward, including ground operations and diplomacy, and the destabilizing impact on global energy markets and international alliances, especially NATO and Asian partners. Robert Pape introduces himself as a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, with a background teaching conventional targeting to the U.S. Air Force. Motivated by a desire to understand why strong military powers often fail in air campaigns, Pape has spent over 2 decades modeling hypothetical bombing campaigns against Iran, particularly targeting its nuclear enrichment facilities. These models consistently revealed that while U.S. forces could destroy industrial infrastructure, they could not effectively eliminate already enriched uranium, which remained intact under the rubble, allowing Iran to resume nuclear progress after attacks. Pape's analysis also accounts for how populations respond politically to military strikes, often rallying around their government instead of collapsing. Professor Pape explains that Iran has adapted strategically, deeply burying its nuclear sites, arsenals of drones, and missile launchers to withstand U.S. airstrikes. Despite technologically superior air power targeting thousands of visible military assets, the United States cannot neutralize Iran's underground capabilities, which continue to threaten shipping lanes and U.S. interests. Drone attacks on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz underscore this limitation. Iran's survival and resilience are partly due to the political mobilization of its population in response to bombing campaigns, similar to historical precedents like Vietnam, where military actions ended up strengthening the regime's grip rather than weakening it. The episode underscores Israel's significant but complicated role in the conflict. Pape characterizes Israel as a diplomatic spoiler, citing instances where Israeli airstrikes have targeted and eliminated Iranian leaders and negotiators who could have facilitated diplomatic resolutions. Examples include the killing of quietist Iranian figures who were reportedly open to negotiation, undermining U.S. diplomatic efforts under Trump. Israel's actions have contributed to the hardening of Iran's position and complicated American strategies, often forcing an escalating military response rather than opening paths to peace. Discussion shifts to the unraveling of U.S. alliances in the Persian Gulf and Asia. The once robust coalition of Gulf states cooperating with the U.S. and Israel is fracturing. Countries like Iraq and Oman are distancing themselves from American military presence, while strategic partners such as Saudi Arabia pivot towards Pakistan for security arrangements. India and Japan, key Asian players reliant on oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz, are resisting U.S. pressure to militarily support America's stance against Iran. This fragmentation diminishes the U.S.'s ability to project power and maintain influence, as regional actors hedge their bets amid rising uncertainties. Pape revisits a multi-stage model of escalation, highlighting that the conflict has already surpassed initial military strikes and counterattacks on shipping. The likely next phase is the introduction of limited ground forces, particularly U.S. Marines establishing footholds along the Iranian coast near the Strait of Hormuz to secure access and possibly control critical oil fields. He emphasizes the difficulty and political cost of an amphibious invasion in the challenging terrain around Hormuz. Moreover, any ground operation would likely result in significant casualties, entrenching domestic support among a core portion of the U.S. population while prolonging the conflict for months, mirroring historical patterns seen in Vietnam. The conversation sensitively addresses the hardships faced by the 90 million people living in Iran. Pape explains how targeted attacks, particularly on Iran's electric power infrastructure, could drastically reduce life expectancy by crippling medical services, food refrigeration, and overall public health. Civilian resistance to power plant attacks means that any such campaign would cause severe humanitarian distress. Additionally, threats of annihilation and ongoing bombings have profound mental health implications, further isolating the population behind nationalist sentiments and away from pro-democracy movements weakened by external and internal pressures. Central to the conflict's trajectory is Iran's nuclear enrichment program, which U.S. air campaigns have failed to halt. Pape warns that within a year, Iran could attain nuclear weapons, bolstering its position as an emerging regional and global power. Such a scenario would force the United States into difficult choices, as backing down could empower Iran and its allies, while escalation risks further instability. Unlike popular fears of immediate nuclear strikes, Pape argues Iran would likely conduct staged nuclear tests to establish credible deterrence rather than using weapons offensively, paralleling North Korea's approach. The episode highlights NATO's deteriorating cohesion and relevance amid the conflict. European allies are reluctant to support U.S. military demands, partly due to surprise strikes and disagreements over the conflict's direction. Pape describes NATO as effectively dead in its operational unity, since member nations are no longer inclined to follow U.S. military leadership unquestioningly, especially into high-risk regional conflicts. This cracks the foundation of Western collective security, leaving the United States increasingly isolated. Control of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran effectively places 20% of global oil supplies under its influence, shifting the balance of economic power. The resultant increased oil prices have broad inflationary consequences, straining U.S. and European economies and potentially increasing interest rates and government debt costs. Pape stresses that disruption in oil supply causes not only economic strains, but delivers political leverage to Iran and its allies, reinforcing their regional authority and challenging U.S. global dominance. Iran's 10-point peace proposal, calling for a permanent ceasefire, lifting of sanctions, recognition of enrichment rights, and revenue sharing from Strait of Hormuz tolls, represents an attempt to solidify its status as a regional hegemon. However, the deal is unlikely to be accepted in the current U.S. political climate. Pape underscores that history shows major powers rarely willingly surrender influence. Therefore, any negotiation will be fraught and incomplete without enforceable conditions, including potential military containment of Israel, which is a difficult prospect given Israel's current posture. Analysis reveals that President Trump is trapped between poor options: escalate to ground war, which risks prolonged conflict and casualties, or withdraw and risk legitimizing Iran's ascendancy and nuclear capability. His public rhetoric, including threats to annihilate Iranian civilization, has only galvanized Iranian nationalism and increased support for nuclear armament. Internally, Trump's waning power complicates consistent policymaking, while politically, his position strengthens hardline stances rather than moderated diplomacy. The episode connects these international tensions with domestic political cycles and emphasizes the need for centrist policies to break dangerous legitimacy and escalation traps. The discussion closes with a reflection on the shared frustrations of ordinary citizens amid polarized politics and international crises. Pape advocates for public discourse that centers on pragmatic, moderate policies, which can empower the majority rather than extreme positions on either side. Highlighting parallels between the American middle class and Iranian society caught in conflict, he underscores the importance of fostering democratic conversation to move beyond cyclical conflict and instability. The narrative stresses that understanding the military-political interplay and its human consequences is vital for crafting sustainable solutions.